Wonderful. Thank you all for joining us for Bill 96 and HVACR, Quebec's French Language Laws HRII webinar. Today, we're joined by Vincent Caron with CEOLaw and Charles Bernard with Impact Public Affairs. I'll introduce them in just a moment. Oh, there is. No, he popped off. What we're going to do today is a deep dive into Quebec's Charter of the French Language main requirements and its regulations for doing business in the province. A lot of important information. We're going to get going in just a couple minutes, but first, a few housekeeping items. This is an interactive webinar, so if you'd like to ask Vincent or Charles any questions, we will be doing so at the end of the presentation. You can put your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen or the chat function as well. We will also be recording this, so if you'd like to watch it or pass it along after the fact, please go to HREI's YouTube page, where it will be later today. So without further ado, let's welcome them back on, Vincent and Charles, who will take you through Bill 96 and its implications for HVACR. There's Charles right now. How you doing?
I'm doing very good, Matt. Thank you.
Wonderful. I'm going to back away and let you guys do your thing.
Thank you, Matt. Appreciate it, and always great to see you. And thanks for hosting us with one of the best webinar voice I've ever heard. So great to be hosted by you and HRAI. So I'll before I show up my slides, I want to just introduce myself quickly. I know a lot of members within HRAI and other partners have met or engaged with some of these informational discussions in the past. The reason why is that I work closely with HRAI as a kind of a link between some of the association needs and requirements and interests with the Quebec government, as you know, and that's part of the discussion we'll have. It's a government that's harder and harder to engage with if you do not speak fluent French. They made it a mission of theirs to kind of promote French, and for them it will start with the government and not the other way around. So since over the last 3 years, I've helped HRI being involved in the situation in Quebec on many files. Some of them you might be well aware of, whether it's the right to repair or the French regulation laws. I've been involved in this, and the goal for today is, on my end, will to give you a bit more context on why we arrived there. It'll be very quick. It'll be very on the surface, just to give you a bit of the political context in which this regulation will kind of evolve and put you and your businesses, and it just gives you a bit more understanding in which environment your businesses will evolve and if you do business in Quebec. And that'll be followed by Vincent, who's going to present himself later on, who's going to give you more granular insights on the regulation, and it will be able, as a lawyer, to answer some of the questions, because there's a lot of gray zones in the regulation, which makes it difficult for somebody like me, who's not a lawyer, to kind of give you the precise advice. So that's why we wanted to do kind of a 1-2 punch approach with more of the political context and then more of the deep dive on the regulation. So I'll go ahead and with my slides. Once again, thanks for being here, thanks for being present, and hopefully we can have a bit of time at the end for discussion and a chat. So I'll share my PowerPoint right now. There you go, and then it should be all right. Everybody's seeing my screen. Please let me know if that's not the case. So political context, Canada and Quebec, pretty straightforward. The reason why I'm going to talk about Canada a bit, I think it's, once again, a good way of understanding where Quebec is going to be kind of positioned regarding to that regulation. And there's one item that I want to mention, which I believe will kind of be a big topic in politics federally, but that this regulation that in which we're going to present is going to have add a layer of complexity for the Quebec situation. So we'll start with a federal outlook on the elections that just arrived in late April, and then we'll follow up with, I'll give you some insights on the polling in Quebec and what type of government that is, and then it'll lead me in the regulation itself, what's the name and the main pillars of it, and then I'll give the mic to Vincent right after this. All right, I just want to move forward. There you go. So as you can see, that's from Canada 338. You can see that's the result of the past elections, and as you can see, the first thing that comes into mind is how divided and bipolar kind of the vote was in Canada. Usually, it's more of a coalition voting, with the Bloc polling a bit closer to 12 to 10%, and NDP closer to 20%. And usually, when those two parties are making traditional numbers, that's where the conservative, for example, if can have a hope of having a governance of the country with 37 and 38% of the vote. So, if you would have given the conservatives and Pierre Poilievre the impression that before the election that he was going to go at 41, 42% of the vote, he would have been certain of having not only a majority, but a very strong one. That's not the dynamic that happened in Canada in the last election. The political context has kind of pivoted towards a spectrum that's similar to the American one, where there's really two major parties. Is that a testament of what's going to happen in the future? I wouldn't necessarily say so, but it is the situation in which we currently live in, where for the last election, it really was a two-party voting situation. On the one end, the Liberal, as you know, their offering was more about giving the tools and the right person and Mr. Carney to deal with the U.S. situation and the impacts of the trade war on the Canadian economy and Canadian society. And then on the other end, on the conservative side, they did two things that are really uncommon for that party in terms of polling, which resulted in good results. The first one is they kind of captured some of the blue collar work that's blue collar voters that are usually associated with the NDP. So that those voters in southern Ontario and the heavy kind of manufacturing belt of Ontario gravitated towards the conservative, and Pierre Poilievre's more discussion and language on employment and on making sure that Canada is a country where you can afford to have a good job and get a great house. That kind of going back to what society was, at least in this perspective, in the past. And then on the other end, what they also did, which was kind of related to the same reasons, was with the housing discussion, they grabbed a lot of the popular vote for young 18 to 35 Canadians. So that's the port that we're in. And why I say it's going to kind of create a big friction point in Quebec with the regulation that we're going to present is that Quebec, the province, did very, very well for the Liberals, right? And they captured a lot of votes there. So you're going to have federally a province of Quebec that's overly represented by the Liberal Party, which is a multicultural, bilingual party. And then you're going to have a provincial party at the moment with the CEQ, which has a strong stance on French and the kind of the unilingual nature of the province. So that's why I thought it was going to be interesting to present that, because I think it's going to characterize kind of the politics moving forward in the province and in Canada. So I won't go over this too slowly, but that's obviously, as you can see, when the lines changed, that's when Mr. Trudeau left office, and then Carney was chosen as a leader of the Liberal Party, kind of changed the table entirely and gave us, or was at least a start towards a portrait that's the one that I just gave you, which is a portrait where 8 months ago it would have been unthinkable. The Conservatives were having historical leads. People in Ottawa here on the Conservative side were already choosing offices. And I always say as a joke, but it's the truth, when you're starting to see opposition MPs take French lessons, that usually means that they're thinking they're going to get in power and they need the French and they want a minister's job. So that was the portrait 8 months ago, and then it flipped overnight with the changes within the Liberal Party. So once again, why do I mention Quebec as a big part of the election? You can see the number of seats they gotten both in Quebec, and also the nature why I said it's more bipolar than usually, with more parties kind of sharing the vote. Ontario is the biggest part of that as well. As you can see in Ontario, it was a strict separation, not separation, but a share of the vote between the Liberals and the Conservative. The Conservative did better in Ontario than they did past elections, but once again, because of how divided the voting was, the Liberals still did very good in Ontario as well, which created this gap in voting that even with almost the same amount of popular vote, the seats were in favor of the Liberal Party, and hence why they're almost sitting at a majority with 170 votes. They're not right there, obviously, but they will be ruling as if they were a majority. They'll be able, I'm pretty sure, to. It won't be an official coalition, obviously, but it'll be a strict kind of ability to work and get the few votes missing every now and then on key policy votes for the party. So when I say those two provinces were major, as you can see in around Ontario, there was a big fight between the Conservatives and the Liberal. Conservatives did better around Toronto than expected, but still the Liberal kind of maintained their fortress around downtown of Toronto, and that's why they won. And why they won so big on the other end is because if you can look at the map of Quebec, it's not very clear because they kind of fused all the writings together, but use the orange dot as a reference. That is the only NDP riding in Quebec. It's in the middle of Montreal. It's Alexandre Boulris' riding. And all around in 2021, all around him was liberal. But if you went out the island, whether it's east, left, or east, north, or south, it was pretty much either bloc or conservative. Now in 2025, you can see that even around the city, especially in the South Shore, there's a lot of voters that went liberal because it's older population and the worry about Trump was a real thing, and that gave us a fortress for the Liberal Party that's going to be in Quebec. So that is a major element. And why is that for me something that I wanted to mention today before talking about the regulation is that, as you know, interprovincial trade has been a huge discussion point. Mr. Carney has also mentioned in interviews leading up to the election that interprovincial trade barriers were one of his priority along housing. So that means that you won't be able to avoid working with the provinces, right? And there's all, if you can see, look at the screen, there's already provinces making deals together. There's already regulation and legislation being passed in Nova Scotia, for example, to ease some of those interprovincial trade barriers. The number on the benefit that would arise if some of the interprovincial barriers are removed is bigger than the economic impact lost of the tariffs under their current fashion, right? So it is an economic priority. And the reason why it will be problematic is that not only the Americans, but a lot of Canadian businesses and provinces are looking at French regulation as a major disruptor and as an element that's impeding ability for businesses to do work in Quebec, sell their products, but also just their ability to market the products. Now, at the same time, it's an item that's extremely important for the leading party in Quebec. And it is also an even more important for the party that is leading the polls currently in Quebec. So that party obviously is the PQ, the Parti Québécois. For those who follow Quebec politics, they've been kind of in the horizon of central politics in Quebec, which they have a strong leader, but very few members in the National Assembly. I think they're sitting at five now, five or six. They won a by-election early this year. But the PQ are leading the polling in a quite dramatic fashion at 33%, and that's been just a steady rise. So this is a party that has made it clear that their first action in government, if they do get elected, is going to be to call a referendum. Now, as you know, that when parties get elected, there's always a different dynamic that sometimes can kind of appear, like realities of power can make you change your mind. But this is a party where the French and the protection of Quebec culture is even more important than the CAQ, which has created the regulation and the legislation that Vincent is going to describe. So you can see where the friction point might arise, where federally the province is widely represented by a liberal party who's trying to fight for internal trade barriers within the country, and at the provincial level you have a current sitting party that made it one of their pride items, right? They're really happy and proud of that legislation, and the party that's leading the polls is somebody that could bring that legislation, or at least that the spirit of the legislation, to another step. And you can see that the vote percentage and the vote sharing between the CAQ and the PQ is major, because some of people voting for CAQ would be switching to the PQ. So that's why even if the CAQ is polling at 21%, in terms of seats distribution, they'd be under four or at four, and they wouldn't be recognized as a official party status, which would be a direct kind of representation of what many thought was going to happen federally with the Liberals. But the CAQ are facing that threat for many reasons, which I won't go into it. But there was a few scandals that kind of piled up together, and it's been a government that's been in the majority for a long time. So there's a bit of fatigue as well. And the Liberals, we're currently going through a leadership race with a lot of people thinking it's going to be Pablo Rodriguez, the former Liberal federal minister, who's going to win the role, are polling at 20%, which is under the CEQ, the CAC, but they are still in terms of seating at 33, and would be a official position in the majority and in the majority party for the PQ. So that's a major item that it takes we need to understand is that the French regulations, even though that federally we're looking at internal trade barriers, the French aspect of protecting French in Quebec and French businesses and your ability to work in French is not something that's going to go away, because if the PQ are making a run for it, but obviously the CEQs are going to be and framing themselves as the parties protecting the French language, and it's going to be something it's going to be a race to the top on the French and not a race to the bottom, in my opinion. So rapidly, those are just the polling changes. The PQ wasn't doing that well 2 years ago, and since then it's been a steady rise. That doesn't mean that sovereignty support is going the same way. As you can see, the no is still trending at 65%, which is stable for over the last 2 years, while the yes on the referendum question is polling a bit more in a negative way. The main reason is obviously kind of the nationalistic kind of feeling that came from all the bad words that were said from Trump towards our country, obviously. So the PQ will have to deal, if they do get elected, with the fact that it's not because people voting for them for change that they're necessarily voting for a referendum. So that, like I said, is kind of directly intertwined with the priority for the current government and potentially the next one about protecting French language. There's a French quote that I've put there that from the Minister Robert, who's the one who created the legislation, that the role of the government is to communicate in French to the Quebecers, not to do it in English or to do anything else. So it kind of gives you the spirit of the law and why it's been so kind of overarching, and it's a large, comprehensive law which has created problems. That's why we're trying to demystify for you, everybody. And I'll go over quickly because Vincent's going to do it anyway. But the law that's which is called the official respecting French, official and common language of Quebec, is divided essentially in four pillars. The last pillar I kind of underlined, which is on public signing, advertising, and the products themselves, is the one that me personally with HRI have been more involved with, because it's also intertwined, like I said, with our advocacy about it, that it could result for some brands in deciding not to sell products in Canada because it's too complex, and that would result in Canadian consumers and Quebecois consumers, more specifically, having less product, less diversity of product for them, and would affect obviously the pricing they're facing and other elements in terms of having access to those products. So it's been part of our advocacy for it, but it's also a lot of manufacturers have asked support on that, because even if the law and there's a lot of work being done around the regulation, it's still unclear about to which extent the OQLF, which is the organism that's in charge of enforcing the law, will kind of be involved in this, because as you might know, the UQLF works on a complaint basis. It's not a police body. Their jurisdiction is limited to Quebec, and Vince is going to talk about it. But it's a body that if there's a complaint, they have to look at it. But so for some companies, there's some gray areas because they do believe that they're doing everything right. But if there's a complaint, then there's an interaction with the OQLF. So the fourth element has been the focus of many of the members that I'm sure are on the call. But the other three are extremely important, as some of these items are coming into force as we're moving forward. So I took pretty much like 15 minutes as promised, and I hope it wasn't too fast. But like I said, just want to give you a bit more clarity on the context and the environment in which this regulation is kind of going to evolve. And with that, once again, I'll say thank you. I'll be open to questions afterwards, and I'll let the real expert, and I don't have the ego to say it. We have a lawyer in the room. We're going to use it. Vincent is going to talk about some of the granular aspects of the law, and we'll be open for questions at the end, just as mentioned. So thanks again, and I'll stop sharing, and then Vincent, I'll give you the mic.
Great. Thanks, Charles, for doing a great job at setting the table and explaining the context. I think it's very useful for the attendees. I also want to thank HREI for inviting me and hosting me, and everyone for joining. My name is Vincent Caron. I'm a Quebec-based corporate and tech lawyer. I've been closely involved with the French charter requirements, both before Bill 96 and since Bill 96. both as a private practitioner, but also I've done 2 franchisation program, as I will talk about a bit later, as a legal director. So I have a pretty, I would say, intricate knowledge of both the requirements, but also I would say the vision of the OQLF around some of those requirements, because as Charles mentions, there's a bit of gray area that we'll explore together. So I'll bring up my presentation. Let me know if you have any issue seeing it. So what I had in mind for us today, first, I won't repeat some of the things that Charles already mentioned, but I think it's still useful to have just an overview of the legal framework, just for you to understand some key concepts before we dig in, and just make sure that you have a good understanding of what we're talking about. Afterwards, we're gonna dig into I would say the deep end with the requirements related to commerce and business. We'll also have a small part of the presentation on franchisation, which I mentioned earlier. It might be a new requirement for some of you. I think there are some important things to take note of in there, and we'll discuss some general challenges, opportunities, and recommendations that apply to you, while keeping a bit of time at the end for some questions and for you to be able to discuss any use case if you want. So first of all, I think once again, Charles did a great job of introducing the Bill 96, but you should know that it's pretty large. The charter has a pretty large breadth. So today we're going to talk obviously just about commerce and business. We could spend many hours discussing this. There's a part on labor relationships, which also, I guess, impacts those of you who have a physical presence in Quebec. But it will not be the subject of the presentation today. All in all, there's 19 different regulations which support the charter. So there's 2 main ones that are of importance for today. One regarding the language of commerce and business, which creates exemptions and clarifies a few key concepts of the provisions of the charter. And there's another one about the marked predominance of French around public signage, which we'll also mention a bit later on. So just a timeline, just to mention that although the entry and force has been spread out through 3 years, essentially, since we're at the very tail end of this, and the full law will be in effect in the coming days, I won't necessarily distinguish between what came into force in 2022, 2023. I'll assume, just for the purpose of this presentation, that everything is applicable as of right now, which will be the case in just a few days. I'll also just insert a small icon for new provisions which were brought by Bill 96, since, as I mentioned, the charter is in effect since the mid-70s, but there's a bunch of new requirements that came with Bill 96, which I will identify in this way. OQLF, Charles once again did a good job of describing the body's kind of perspective and mission. Just to give you an idea, right now I think there are about 400 employees or so. They handle and process around 9,000 complaints and about 9,000 inspections yearly. So they have some pretty interesting means. I would say, as a governing body, we see that in other sectors the regulators are, I would say, less staffed, but the OQLF have the resources to really enforce the law, and they also position themselves as helping businesses and governance. Maybe the lived experience varies from one business to the other, but what they do essentially is publish a lot of guidance documents, and they're fairly receptive when you call them to helping businesses who want to comply, give them some additional information and tips. So that's also part of their role. So with that said, I think we can start with the specific requirements around commerce and business. One thing that's very important to understand, the law is drafted as if it applied to the whole business. So there's only a few, I would say, distinctions If you only have a small footprint in Quebec, or if you're an outside manufacturer shipping products in Quebec, it assumes that the obligations apply to the whole of the business. Of course, it makes no practical sense to think like that. So I would say that one of the governing principle that really helps put us in the right mindset to interpret and understand some of those requirements is the fundamental right that we find in Article 5, which means that consumers of goods and services have a right to be informed and served in French. Essentially, what I would say the spirit of this section of the law is that someone who lives in Quebec only speaks French and wants to buy some goods and services shouldn't need to learn another language in order to be able to purchase them, use them, and not have any security concerns, for example, because the security information is only in English. So that's I would say the prism through which I would invite you to see most of the requirements that we're going to see together. The definition of consumer, of course, is a physical person. So it's not a company, it's really an individual person. Some of the obligations I will mention are also extend to just business in general, so in between companies, but there's always an additional layer, I would say, of compliance needed when you deal with physical customers. And for most of these gray areas, I would recommend to be very prudent. If you're offering products and services to consumers directly, I think you should have perhaps a broader interpretation of the law, rather than if you're just dealing with doing business to business or dealing with government agencies, for example. So a few topics around commerce and business which are addressed in the charter are service, inscriptions on products and labeling, all other commercial documents, contracts, software, invoices. We'll go through most of them, but I would say even today, trying to be as granular and precise as possible, we'll be only able to scratch the surface. It's a fairly technical legislation with, like I said, a bunch of supporting regulation and some additional layer of guidance, which is non-binding, but still produced by the OQLF, which needs to be accounted for when looking at the legal landscape. So just starting with service, that's a new edition of Bill 96, which mentions that an enterprise that offers goods or service to consumers must respect their right to be informed and served in French. And you'll note that in the second paragraph, it states that if you are offering goods or services to another type of public, you must inform them in French. So there's not the notion of service here. What this means is, if once again you're manufacturing something that's in a big box retail store or something like that, you would need to have customer service in French. So one of your employees or some of your employees being fluent enough in French to be able to serve customers. That was already a principle. There's a lot of interplay between the French Charter and the Consumer Protection Act, which already included similar principles, but here it's now really crystallized as a right in French. Sometimes it's harder to do that because obviously the French resources, if you're located in certain parts of the world, are not necessarily abundant. So it could be a challenge. In practice, there's no strict position on the exact level of fluency. So I've experienced some situations where technically a service in French was offered, but it was mediocre at best. So the regulation does not go into really the quality of service, but the principle is that you should be able to offer service in French, for example, for customer support if you're selling something in Quebec. Another, I would say, perhaps one of the most complex and technical obligation is regarding inscriptions on products and labeling. The main principle is that everything on a product, its container or wrapping, meaning if it's sold in a box, the box itself, the product itself contained in the box, every layer of product labeling or container must be in French. There can be another language present, but not with greater prominence than French. You'll find on the right of my slide, that's an example given by the OQLF. An example where we find the trademark Happy Teeth. It's a fictional trademark, of course, but what this example serves to illustrate is that if you have a registered trademark, so let's say registered Happy Teeth is a registered trademark in Canada, you can use it in English if there's no French version available that exists. But everything else needs to be translated to French with the same prominence level on the product. So you couldn't say in the past, some companies tried to say, well, my trademark is Happy Teeth toothpaste whitening gum care. That's not, if there's a descriptive portion of the trademark, the descriptive portion, although it's contained in the registered trademark itself, must also be translated to French. So that's the first exemption. The first exception I would say is trademarks. There's a few other exceptions to this rule. There's a bunch of things that can appear on a product that are not in French, which is, for example, the name of an establishment. So your address or your manufacturing facility or something like that, you don't need to translate, obviously, this part of the product. If there's something that indicates the origin or is a special denomination for a specialty of product. So, for example, I'm thinking Scotch, for example. There's no, it would be an example of things you could keep in another language and then French on a product. A place, as I mentioned earlier. And what is interesting and fairly recent, since last year, they reverted back to the concept of recognized trademark. So not only something that's registered, but something that's recognized, which typically means unregistered trademarks as well, which benefit from a kind of recognition or that are really used as trademarks. This is one of the gray areas I was mentioning. What constitutes a recognized trademark might be arguable one way or the other. Sometimes it's been rejected by the OQLF. Of course, the cleanest way to do that is to have a trademark registration, which also presents other advantages. But you must know that at least if you don't have a registered trademark, at least you could argue that if your trademark is recognized, then you could include it in a language other than French on your products. There's a bunch of larger exemptions, which are not only for certain inscriptions on the product, but are broader, which means that you could bypass this inscription obligation altogether. And there's a notion in there of intent of the market. So you'll see that the first exemption is the product is intended for a market outside of Quebec. How do we really determine this? Once again, there's some guidance around this, but it's not 100% clear. What is clear, however, is if you are distributed in a store chain in Quebec, it's intended for the Quebec market. If you do for example, some specialized marketing, you target the Quebec market specifically in your marketing initiatives, you would intend the products for Quebec as well. But other than that, if you're just, for example, a manufacturer making something available on the market without any specific effort or intent to market in Quebec, you might be able to benefit from this exemption. The other exemptions is for example, if you bring in a product for a convention, a conference, or an exhibition, these principles do not apply. If it's to be incorporated in a finished product, so if it's only a part of or a sub-assembly of a larger item or just a component, then you could also benefit from this exemption. And there's also an exemption for things that are engraved, baked, or inlaid in the product itself, riveted or welded or embossed into it, which is also another exemption. So a few exemptions, but once again, I would say if an end customer can buy it from a store in Quebec, you probably cannot benefit from any of those exemptions. And if you do business to business deal, then we need to look a bit further at what your company is doing. Are you really marketing outside of Quebec? Do you benefit from one or maybe many of those exemptions? But just know that they're there, and they try to soften the initial principle and stance brought in by the Quebec Charter. There's also just a thing of note. I've had questions in the past around the phase out. Does it mean that on June 1st I need to remove everything from my store shelves? There's a kind of a grace period, which is not really a grace period because you can't. There can be new products entering into Quebec, which are or being distributed in Quebec, which are non-compliant after June 1st, 2025. But for products that were already being distributed, for example, on store shelves, they can still be sold until June 1st, 2027. So you have like a 2-year grace period, but just for products that were already built and distributed prior to June 1st, 2025. Next thing is around catalogs, brochures, folders, commercial directories, and just a note. I'll get into this a bit further down the line. But when you read things like that, there's an equivalence principle in the charter, meaning that it's not restrictive. So if you read an enunciation such as this one and you say, well, this does not apply, for example, to social media posts, well, the Charter of French Language says that it's all technological equivalence. So it also applies to digital forms of these things. Other forms of commercial documents that would have the same aim or goal would also be captured by this. The other thing I want to note is sometimes people have the I would say the intuition of saying, well, there's a loophole there. It's not naming this thing, so maybe we can take this track to avoid legislation. Contrary, for example, to tax legislation, which is restrictive, this type of legislation is deemed protective by the Quebec court. So, on the contrary, the interpretation that courts will make of these obligations will be large and liberal, as they say. So, meaning that you can't just rely on a wording omission to justify your business practice. If it clearly contradicts the spirit of the law, chances are that Quebec courts will enforce it, although the wording might allow an argument in your favor. You shouldn't have this reading of the charter, which is, like I said, broad because it is protective in nature, as intended by the legislator. So for catalogs, brochures, and other commercial documents of this nature, they must also be in French. With that said, you can have 2 different versions, one in French, one in English, or any other language, as long as they're of equivalent accessibility and quality. Meaning that, for example, you could have in your English PDF just an hyperlink to another French version of the same PDF, or as long as you don't need an additional layer of technology to access it, it's fine. There's been some debates also around the use of QR codes and things of this nature. The general rule I would tell you is that if you need to go through extra steps, if, for example, you have access to a document in English and you need some other device on you, or you need to do a bunch of different stuff to access the French equivalent, probably you're not offering the same equivalent accessibility and quality. But if it's fairly available, so for example, you're on a website and you could just toggle between French and English, that is deemed equivalent accessibility and quality for the purpose of the charter. Also, there's other exemptions similar to the product inscriptions around certain types of information that could be in English only or in another language only, and also limited exceptions for conventions and things of this nature. So if you're in Montreal, for example, and a trade show, if it's limited to a certain audience, you might not need to translate all of your booth materials and your signage and things like that. If it's just for a limited commercial public, you could maybe benefit from this exemption for your commercial materials. Contracts is one obligation that most people do not think of or omit. And it's a pretty important one because if you don't comply with this, the charter provides that the contract can be annulled. So if you sign a contract and you don't respect the principles of the charter, you might end up not having a contract at all, and not being able to enforce it. Once again, there were already protections in place for consumers in the Consumer Protection Act, but now the charter gives an additional layer of protection to French consumers. French-speaking consumers by mentioning that for contracts of adhesion, a contract of adhesion means a contract that's templated and essentially drafted by a party, and that you cannot negotiate at will, that you just sign or don't sign. The typical example is a cell phone contract, for example, which you can't really negotiate. So for those of you who might have installation contracts or maybe online terms and conditions of sale for equipment or things of this nature, you can only bind a French-speaking customer if they were presented with the French version first and really chose not to sign the French version. In the past, what businesses did is they just included a language clause in there mentioning both parties agree that the contract will be drafted in English, and it was sufficient. Now you can still do that for business-to-business contract when you're not dealing with consumers. There's a few named contract in the charter which are necessarily you need to present a French version, but I would say in most business contracts you can still use this language clause. But when you're dealing with consumers, whether it's your terms and conditions online or a form for a job or installation or the purchase of an equipment, you really need to provide the French version at the same time in order for the English version to be binding, and cannot only rely on that language clause that we used to use in the past. Invoice receipts is more of the same, so this also needs to be in French. There's less exceptions for these. Principle being that I guess there's not much information in there. So if you have a sale of equipment in Quebec, you should be able to provide a French invoice or a receipt. Once again, you could have bilingual documents. It's not an issue. Or you could give access to both at the same time, but the French version needs to be provided. Perhaps one of the most controversial and criticized requirements for business is around public sign, posters, and commercial advertising. Once again, the principle is fairly simple at its core, that public signs and posters and commercial advertising must be in French. They could also be in both language if the French is markedly prominent, and there's been a lot of discussion on what it means, and I won't bore you, and I won't be able to provide all the details, but generally we consider the French to be markedly predominant if it draws the attention at least as much as the English version, and it's at least twice as large in terms of font size, I would say, and physical presence on a building. I've included an example on my next slide, but that's the main principle. It does not apply to news media that would publish in other languages than French, so you don't need to, if you publish, for example, in a English-only journal, you don't need to abide by this. And there's also other smaller exemptions in there. Here is an example of the marked predominance of French, also extracted from the OQLF itself. Best beef, for example, would, even if it's a trademark, would be okay to include, but you would need to include a French description. So, for example, boucherie or butcher shop, which is twice as big, or two different indication, as in the second example, which leads to the French portion being predominant in the public signage. There's some additional rules if you have billboards. It's a very, I would say, very complex area. Rules are a bit different if you're advertising on your own premises that you own, or if you're advertising on the highway, for example. But know that it's a really important aspect of the charter, just the public signage. And generally, the principle is that you'll need to have a marked predominance of French in any type of public signage in the province, starting on June 1st, 2025. What about websites? That's a question I often get. The charter does not expressly name websites, but as I mentioned a bit earlier, there's an equivalence principle in there. I've translated a quote directly from the OQLF, mentioning that essentially you need to apply by analogy the principle of the charters to everything that's on the web or digital. They say that, for example, the presence of a bilingual homepage cannot be does not break the law. If you use a way to toggle between French and English, it could be okay. What I usually give in terms of advice for people asking questions around their website is to really look at what you're doing with your website. So what are the functionalities? So of course, if you're delivering a service, so if you have an app or you're delivering a SaaS service through your website, then you'll be captured by, if it's a service, then the consumer of this service needs to interact with the website, and probably the portion of your website that delivers this service and the UI needs to be available in French. If there's some product documents, it's not because they're hosted on a website rather than physically printed that they're exempt from the charter. So if owner's manual and things of this nature also should be found in French on the website. Contracts, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of service, things of this nature would need to be translated as well. But aside from this, I would say it's really important to look at everything your website does and try to find an analogy in the charter and see if you can benefit from exemptions. Would this be captured? Would this be captured under one of the requirements we just talked about or not? And I would also mention that social media is more of the same. So publications made on social media would also be deemed like a publication you make in another form of media. So it's the principle of equivalence I was talking about earlier. I see that we are getting a bit low on time, so I'll accelerate just to keep a bit of time for your questions. I wanted to mention the franchisation requirements because, once again, I noticed that some people are unaware or might misunderstand the requirements. Starting on June 1st, companies that have 25 or more employees in Quebec need to register with the OQLF. And then there's a process that starts afterwards. Once you register, you have 3 months to do an assessment of your situation using a form that's provided by the OQLF and which is very comprehensive. It's something that's pretty long to do, where you need to assess how your processes include French or not, with the level of proficiency of your officers and managers and things of this nature. Once submitted to the OQLF, they make a determination to see if your use of French is widespread enough or not. If it's considered okay, they move to the certification directly. If not, they order the company to do a franchisation program, which is essentially a project management type of document mentioning every action that will be taken to correct the omissions and non-compliances, and with a specific time frame. From my experience, the OQLF is fairly flexible around timing as soon as they see that there's some good progress being made and that the companies are willing to comply and make efforts in this way. So I think the delays are not necessarily as big as an issue as we could think, but still it's a very comprehensive, and I won't, I'll be fairly transparent, it's costly and complicated. And once you get this certification, whether or not you needed to do the franchisation program, once you get your certificate, you need to submit a triennial report on the evolution of the use of French within the company. So it's an ongoing process every 3 years afterwards. And I should mention that you need to employ a 25 person for a consecutive period of 6 months or more in order for this obligation to trigger. If you're employing 100 or more people in Quebec, you must also put in place a committee with half of the representative being employees. And it's a whole other, I would say, set of obligations, including delivering minutes and different other documents issued by the committee to the OQLF. And the OQLF can meet with certain committee members at some point in time and audit different actions taken by the committee in-house. So just to recap, I ran through some of those requirements. I'm sorry, it's pretty dense, but just wanted to outline some of the challenges for business such as yours willing to comply. Of course, like I mentioned, the broad and liberal interpretation of the law and the several gray areas makes for an important challenge. Through the years, I gathered many different tips and guidance and real cases of how to handle different situations. But by just reading the law, there's still a lot that's unclear. And we must also remember that most of these obligations are fairly recent. So it's possible that the OQLF changes its policy or way of enforcing the law as time goes on. So there's a level of ambiguity there, certainly to account for. It's also, to be frank, it's quite costly and can be complex. So you need accurate translation. Sometimes if it's even more complicated, if it's technical, you need to update your internal processes and assign internal resources as well. As far as non-compliance goes, I already mentioned a few things. It could void your contracts. There's also some monetary fines in there for violation. The OQLF has the power to deliver orders and obtain injunctive relief. So, for example, if you're a manufacturer outside of Quebec who does not comply, they most likely, since their jurisdiction is only Quebec, and that's also something to take into account in your risk assessment. I would be very surprised if they were to undertake a legal claim in your home jurisdiction, but what's likelier is they could issue an order, for example, making it impossible for your products to be shipped and distributed in Quebec. So that's something within the realm of their power. There's also reputational damage, of course, since some of those records are public, and it's never a good, although the public, I would say, in Quebec is quite divided on some of the OQLF action, still not the greatest to be identified publicly as an uncompliant business. As far as opportunities, I was trying to find a bit of silver lining in all of this. Of course, if you translate your documents, aside from Quebec, there's a pretty large French-speaking market worldwide. So a good French translation can't hurt in this regard if you have any ambitions to expand to those French-speaking countries. It also, I think, Quebec customers respond fairly positively to brands and businesses that have French material. So French marketing has always been appreciated, I think, by the Quebec marketplace, and it can also give you a competitive advantage because it's as with every law, it's a kind of barrier of entry. So if you take the time to do a good compliance program and your competitors don't, well, it can be an advantage in this sense. My general recommendations before we get to questions, and I'm sorry the time really went by fast, is to assess your materials and processes and come up with a strategy. It can seem like a lot at first, but when we really try to look at it more granularly, there's some low-hanging fruits probably that could be done, and that shows already a commitment and some efforts in the right way to comply with those requirements. I would start by everything that's customer facing for reasons I already mentioned. I think that's really the starting point for every business, is to say what goes in the hand of my customers and end users, and really start with that. Also, it's important to just raise awareness internally for those employees who need to know. So marketing employees, product designers who work with labels and things like that should know about these, and just maybe think about them at the onset of a new project rather than once it's done and you need to comply. And of course, working with translators and legal advisors if needed is recommended because of the technical nature of all of these requirements. So with only a few minutes remaining, so apologies for that once again. I was going to go to questions, so if Matt can
You bet.
share a few, I'd be glad to answer them.
Don't apologize. A lot of good information that we had to fit into an hour, so I'm glad you got it out. First and foremost, are you providing, or will we be able to provide these slides to registrants?
Yeah, sure.
I have your permission to. Yep.
Yeah, with pleasure.
Okay, certainly. So I'll do that. If you're watching this, you'll get the presentation sent to your email. There is a French language question in the Q&A that I will leave to one of you guys.
Okay.
But the first one off the top is, what about products such as appliances? Do they also need to be written in French? Do markings on products need to be in French, such as on and off?
Mm-hmm. Good question. I would say yes. If your appliances are to be used in for home purposes, so not large commercial appliances, yes, they would need to be covered in French. As far as the interface, that's a bit more, I would say, trickier. For example, the warning labels on the side of the appliances and our origins and things of this nature would need to be in French. Oftentimes, if the product allows, we'll have a separate French label on the product. As far as the interface, so the would say on off and maybe level of heat and things of this nature. I think there's a level of flexibility on that. If once again, I think the spirit is if someone using this appliance just speaking French is likely to naturally understand how it works and is not being exposed to any danger. I think on-off is a pretty universal language, and if you have like just an icon for heat or something like that, it could be okay. If the menu is more using words, so let's say you have a very complex digital appliance where you need to navigate through menu, that would seem like a bad idea. But if you would have this type of product, then technically, yes, the UI would need to be translated to French as well.
I'll also say, Vincent, to this, and let me know if I'm wrong, but I know that for many cases, the on and off for some of the basic instruction on products is engraved in the product, not necessarily a
Yeah.
sticker. If it's engraved, then it wouldn't be like it was part of the initial legislation, I think, Vincent, but it got
Yeah.
removed because I think they realized the manufacturing implications of the engraving. So for a lot of coffee machines, for example, it's engraved. So if it's an on and off engraved in English, to answer your question, I think it will be okay to remain in English. But if it was, for example, a sticker where it's on and off, then it's a different kind of a situation. Am I right on this, Vincent?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's one of the exemptions around the products that we saw earlier. So yes, you really need to look at your product specifically. But yeah, I think we exposed like the general idea around that. But of course, for products of this nature, it's always best to have a really case by case analysis. But generally, I think we provided the right concepts for you to. Yeah.
Maybe one of you guys can tackle the second question there. If you look in the Q&A button,
Okay.
the French language question, or I can put it into the
I'll ask it to you, Vincent, in English.
Okay.
You'll give the answer. Is that okay?
Yeah, perfect.
So Josiah asks in French, and thank you, Josiah, for the question. What are we doing with some of the words that are anglicized words, right? Well, there's not really a French version of that word, and some of these words they permeate, they're in the documentation and sometimes on the products. So there's a lot of words that within the industry nobody uses a French version. Is that a gray area? Is that something that OQLF will tolerate, or would these companies and members would have to adapt and find the actual closest thing in French?
So it's a very interesting question. Actually, there's some we can think about automotive. I'm pretty certain that the attendees industry also works mostly in English, so a lot of technical terms are just understood in English and used in English. There's a tool actually developed by the OQLF, which is a guide for translation. So if there's an already existing French equivalent and there's something that's called, I think, vitrine linguistique, which is a kind of a dictionary, if you will, of French equivalents, then you would need to use the French equivalent. I would say that from experience, if you have technical terms which are untranslated and you include them in your French version, it's not something that is I would say that would call for an enforcement by the OQLF. If once again, I think there's a good faith effort to use French where it's needed, and you're using the term because either it's untranslated or it's well recognized in the industry, and even perhaps it informs the end customer better than if you were to use an obscure French equivalent. I saw some flexibility around this. One of my franchisation program that I did was a company in an industry that was fairly complex and technical in nature and that used a lot of English language things. And I think they're fairly flexible as long as you use French where appropriate. And maybe you could use this vitrine linguistique tool to see if there's any French equivalent while you're translating those documents.
Thank you so much. There's a question in the chat. If any manufacturer has specific questions or clarifications, should they directly approach OQLF or HREI to get answers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's I wouldn't be interested to hear Charles' take on this one. It's the same dynamic, I would say, with all regulators. In a way, they want to make themselves available to assist and answer questions, but at the same time, if you overexpose your situation and you get a very conservative response, then you're kind of stuck with the knowledge of their response. What I like to do personally is when it's an unclear area, and I do this all the time for clients, is I just call on a confidential anonymous basis. So you could just work on a hypothesis. Let's say I'm a manufacturer. Would this work, or could you help me out with something, without giving your name and too much information on your specific case. But yeah, it's always a, I would say, a double-edged type of thing, because if you go too far into those discussions, you might raise attention on what you're doing, and if you're not 100% compliant, it could bring some issues. But generally, I think the intent is to still help and provide some guidance. So it's a resource that's out there, but I think you need to be a bit cautious when approaching those situations. What do you think about that, Charles?
Yeah, I agree. I agree with Vincent. It's also kind of contradictory at the same time, because if your manufacturer is engaging directly with the UQLF, it kind of shows also the good faith aspect of a company try to comply, right? So it's a and the other layer that thing is obvious, but if you don't have a French representative, it's harder to they can sometimes provide I've seen it like engage in a very little English just to make sure that the communication is fair, but I do believe that if you're really in need of clarification, maybe going through, if you're a member of HRI, going through the association at first, maybe that information I have it, or I have more documentation on it that can give you a general perspective. And if it's not sufficient, then maybe we can look at setting that meeting up, because we have the contacts over there. And if you don't have the French support, it's something that HRI could do through me and my team. But on the other hand, I wouldn't feel either on the other hand, I wouldn't feel bad if you want to interact directly with the QLF, because they're there for that. But they're also an organism that's promoting French. So some of their answers, without necessarily giving you the answer to your question, because of all the gray areas, they will also kind of, and I think Vincent would agree, they will always kind of tell you, when in doubt, right? Can I do it
Yeah.
in French? So they'll never give you kind of the negative. And some interactions I've had, to be quite honest, sometimes they were more clear about, for example, what Vincent mentioned about the menus, the digital menus. They obviously said that it should follow the regulation, but they were also saying it's not something that they have the resources to look at the moment, right? So you kind of make what it is with that. And I know from a manufacturing standpoint, it might not be enough, but those interactions are important. But at the same time, it can create a bit more scrutiny on your behalf. But HREI has the time and the resources to support through me, Perry, and Vincent is also not too far. So it's work that we can do. And feel free to ask questions first before maybe engaging, and we can find different ways to support.
Wonderful, thank you. There is another question, and I know we're running a bit over, but these are all important. Do you have a link to the OQLF dictionary that we can put in chat, or just kind of
Yeah,
verbally here?
I would. Not sure if I'll be able to find it really quick, but I could, if
No
I'm
worries.
going to share my slide, I could make sure to share the link as well. And I think it's a fairly, once again, the struggle of using the OQLF tools and guidance documents is
I
a bit
think I should.
ironically they're only they're only in French, but once you get at least once you get to the right page, you can access the tool, and I think it's fairly intuitive. Or you could use your browser's translator. So I'll be sure to communicate
Sure.
it as at the same time as the slides.
I've sent Vincent the link to the Vitrine Linguistique. I don't
Okay,
know if I can put it in the chat as well for everybody.
Sure.
I think there's multiple tabs in there, right, Vincent, depending
yeah,
on what people need. But yeah, so we'll make sure that you get it through maybe the normal fashion. But if you look in the chat, there's going to be the link to the Vitrine Linguistique. Obviously, no surprise that you can't really get that version in English. But yeah, it is what it is.
It's a bit of a mouthful of a link too. So yeah, we'll put those on the presentations that we're setting as well. But if you're watching right now, that it's in the chat for you too.
It's not linguini, people. It's something else. It sounds like it, but it's a bit different.
I don't even want to try. Wonderful, guys. It's a few minutes past. Any follow closing words before we say goodbye?
Well, thanks for the time. Thanks for having us.
Likewise.
Just wanted to thank everyone for taking the time. It was a pleasure.
And thank you both for doing this, for providing this really important information. And it'll be on our HRA YouTube page as well for anyone who wasn't able to join us today. But I'll probably see you guys again later. Until then, thank you very much, and everyone who showed up to this webinar.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Have a great rest of the day, guys. Cheers.
Cheers.